As someone on the forums noted, it is satellite season. Between now and the World Series of Poker, there'll be thousands of seats given out in the WSOP main event, and there's some World Poker Tour events yet to play as well. And then the new NAPT. There's tons of satellites going on stars for that. A lot of satellites happening, and they're pretty good money. Um, this one was pretty tough. It's the smaller ones, or the smaller buy-in ones, or the huge ones that have been heavily advertised. Usually tend to have weaker fields. This one was either Tuesday or Wednesday night. I forget which one is which. One of them's a 300, one of them's a 500. But this was the first time I've played one of these satellites in quite some time, couple of years probably. And this was a $300 buy-in World Poker Tour satellite that they have either every Wednesday or every Tuesday. $300 buy-in. The packages are $12K. Anything that doesn't add up to packages gets spread out. the payouts are very steep in satellites like this one. When playing a satellite, you need to know how steep the payout structure is going to be. We could do a whole separate video on ICM, but I have a short demonstration here that will talk about how and why that works in a very, just like 2 or 3 minutes. What we have here is an ICM calculator. It tells us that what we've set up, this is paying 5 seats. Each of the top 5 spots is the same payout. The rest of the spots get nothing, and we have 10 players left. So this is what it looks like when things are paying half the field. Some satellites are giving away, I see satellites to the Sunday Million that are $75 or something, where a third of the field gets paid. In those things, you're just looking to survive. You're not looking to build a big pile of chips, and once you get a certain number of chips, there's no point in building anymore. So tournament considerations and ICM stuff has a big effect on those tournaments. Here we can show why that is just by saying that player 1 doubles up and breaks player 2. We calculate that. What we see is that player 1's equity went from 0.10 to 0.1556. So this guy lost all of his equity. He's got no chips left. He can't win anything. And his 0.1 didn't go all to this guy. In fact, only a little more than half of it went to this guy. The rest of it went to these guys. They each got 5.5% of the prize pool worth of equity out of that hand being played. The reason for that is that if 3 more of these guys do that, and this guy has all of the, this guy has 5,000 in chips, and say 4 more do that, so the tournament's over. This guy has 6,000 in chips, and 4 other guys have 1,000. This guy with the $6,000, his equity is still only 0.2. He can't go above 0.2. There's no prize that pays higher than that. So with a very flat payout structure, when you double up, it doesn't mean as much. When you lose chips, it does. So you have to be very cautious. This guy would have to be getting, you'd have to be about a 2-to-1 favorite, or getting about 2-to-1 on your money in order to get all in pre-flop in this spot. And it's rare to be a 2-to-1 favorite. So when you're playing these, this is like a double or nothing, sit and go kind of situation. So when you're playing a satellite with a very flat payout structure, you think a lot about tournament considerations, and you play very cautiously. If we change the payout structure, in this tournament that we're about to look at, as with a lot of online satellites to big live events, only a very small percentage of the field gets paid, and they get all the money. So here we're simulating 10% of the field getting paid all the same prize. And we go back to everybody having the same equity when everybody's got the same chips. But now, when this guy doubles up, he actually doubles his equity. Because what we're simulating here is not just top 10%, but because there's only one spot, we're simulating winner take all. And in a winner-take-all tournament, the equity is exactly the same. Every chip is worth the same amount. So in a winner take all tournament or a tournament with a very steep payout structure, you play a lot closer to cash game play and a lot less like typical tournament play. You're willing to take risks. Anything that's a favorable gamble, you'll take it. You're taking 51-49 advantages. Now, I don't really take 51-49 advantages. I think that my skill advantage over a field is too big to take a 51-49, but I'll take some things pretty close to that. Or if there's an overlay from extra chips in the pot, I'll take a 50-50 because there are those extra chips in the pot. So when the payout structure is very steep and there are only a few seats given away, a very small percentage of the field is going to be paid, you are playing basically like cash game strategy. You're not avoiding risks. You're just trying to accumulate chips whenever you can. Because if you get busted first or if you get busted 90% of the way through the tournament, you still lose all your chips and all your equity and don't get anything. So you might as well build up a big stack and keep accumulating. And what you're doing is just trying to build up chips whenever you can. I'm not doing anything stupid in this tournament, but I am putting up a fight. So that's how you adjust to the different types of satellite structures. You look at how many seats are being paid, how many seats of the field that's left are being paid, and how likely you are to end up in one of them. In this spot, if you had 5,000 chips and everybody else had 1,000, that would mean the next guy who goes out is busted. And even if you get aces, you probably shouldn't play him. There's just no reason to play if you're going to already be guaranteed a seat. You can't win 2 seats. So that's a quick basic primer on figuring out how to play in different satellite fields. Now we'll get to it. So this was a $300 buy-in. We had 112 players. The packages were $12,000 that were being given away. A $10,000 shooting star or LAPC seat and $2,000 in travel expenses. That means that we didn't quite have enough to give away 3 spots. So we had enough for 2 packages, and then they spread the rest of the money out. Third place won $3,000, and it went down all the way to 9th place, which won $600. This is still a very heavily weighted toward the top sort of field. More than 2/3 of the money in the entire prize pool is in the top 2 spots out of 112. So this is still very heavily weighted toward the top, and we have to play fairly close to cash game strategy and be willing to take risks when it's the right time to do so. So we basically played pretty close to cash game strategy for much of this tournament. Stacks are quite deep to start, 3,000 with 10, 20 blinds, and they went up pretty slowly. I think it was 12-minute levels until a certain time, and then it was 15-minute levels. So a very good structure and a very strong field. There were some losing players in this tournament for sure. As I've gone back and looked some of them up in official poker rankings, I have found some losing players. But as you can see, especially Ruthless here, 2 to my right, is a monster player. He's a very strong tournament player. And a number of these other players are significant winning players. And as we get down to the final table, we end up with a lot of very strong players. So there's some interesting discussion here on dealing with strong players. It's not a bad start. I see the raise, and I want to re-raise not only to isolate, but maybe to win the pot now. If this guy's in fairly late position, if he's just messing around, he'll fold, and that'll be fine with me. Also, I don't want to call here and get raised and not know what to do. So when I re-raise here, it serves not only to protect my hand, but also to allow me to fold my hand if there's a monster hand involved here. I don't know anything about these 2 players, but what I know is they've entered a $300 tournament. The blinds are only 10-20, and they've both been willing to commit 600 chips over a raise and a re-raise. I'm just not going to put up a fight here. I'll conserve my 2,820 chips and throw my ace-king away. And in a $10 buy-in tournament, I would tell my students to shove here. because you're going to be well ahead of the kind of range that these people have. But in a $300 tournament, you sort of expect that you're, not in great shape here, and that you really don't want to see a flop with ace king for this many chips. If I was going to play this hand, I'd stick it all in, and I really don't think that's a good idea at this point. As it turns out, these guys don't have monster hands, but maybe they did have monster. Maybe one of them did have a monster hand. I remember that thinking that how strange it was that Pam Cam would fold there. Go back and look at that hand again. Either way, it would have been a bad thing for me to go, deep into this hand, because the flop is not good for me. The turn is not good for me. So when Pam Cam calls here, you have to, what could this possibly be? I mean, is this going too far with ace king, with a very inexperienced player, or is it, a pair of sixes that just, is calling because he's not sure if he's ahead or not? It's hard to say, but there's really no hand he can have that is correct for him to call this bet and then not call on the river. A pair of fives would be an option, but if he's got even potentially a pair of sixes, some people might play, but a pair of fives, at least giving him a straight draw, an open-ended straight draw, would suck some people into calling this bet. I would have bet the flop instead, and then checked behind on the turn with a pair of fives here, but I guess that's like the best hand I can come up with for this spot, and still it's played wrong. So when you see a player, this is one of the ways you can learn about opponents. I see this guy make a play, and at the time I thought this exact same thing, and I actually took a note. I see him make a play that I can't come up with a hand that it was right. There's not even a flush draw out if he was going to play a flush draw that way. But even that would be a mistake. So there's no hand I can come up with where he made the right play there by calling 600 pre-flop, checking behind on the flop, and calling 1,000 on the turn and folding the river. It's just very weak play, and there's no hand I can come up with where that's the right play. So even though we didn't get to see this guy's hand, I did take a note on him at the time that he was probably weak or inexperienced and didn't really know what was going on. We didn't learn a whole lot about Cool here because we can come up with a number of hands that it might be correct to play the way that he did. He might have had aces. He might have had tens. Could have had a lot of things. Could have had ace 10. There are a lot of hands he could have played correctly here. It could be that he just had, that he had ace jack and knew that he could take the pot down on the end. It's hard to say, but there are a lot of hands where that would be correct or incorrect. We didn't really learn much about this guy, but we did learn about Pam Cam CH here, and learn that that's probably not a strong player. If you're gonna survive in fields like this, you've got to make every nickel that you can, and noting a player like this being a weak player is really important because you're not going to see that many weak players in a tournament like this. It's a pretty strong field. Well, let's look at this one again too. I've slowed it down a little bit here so we can pay a little more attention to what's actually going on in the hand. Replayers doing weird things here. So open from under the gun, and then a call from the small blind and the big blind. You have to put at least the small blind and probably the big blind as well on speculative hands. On the small blind, you can't put on much of anything because this guy probably doesn't know what he's doing. This guy you have to put on some sort of speculative hand. He's not going to make that call with king deuce offsuit in most cases, but he will make it with 6-8 suited. What he won't do is make that call with kings. He's got a speculative hand here. and he's looking to see a flop with it, whether it's small pair or connected or one gapped cards or suited cards. But it's not a big hand, and it's not a completely junk hand most of the time. Big Shadow, you put on a fairly strong hand here just because he raised from under the gun, and the blinds are so small, and it's a fairly good sized buy-in tournament, so you expect strong play. Fairly standard continuation, but maybe a little small, but fairly standard. And then a big raise. Beast to East is not playing around here. Would like to win the pot right now. This is probably not a draw, although it could be. If it's a draw, he's really taking a risk because Big Shot Owl could fold, and then he's in a tough spot with his draw. That is probably two pair or a set. It could be open-ended straight flush draw, or open-ended straight draw and a flush draw, or something like that. But it's probably two pair or a set, or he hit top pair and wants to find out if it's good for real. Maybe even hit second pair. But this is a pressure bet. He's betting enough that he's really kind of threatening either of these players' entire stacks. With a bet and a call already, though, I would guess this is not he's not playing around. He's got a real hand here. I did consider calling here. I just decided it wasn't worth the trouble. The blinds are so small, and position was too early. If I had this hand on the button and there was a raise here, I would call with the 9-7 suited. But being in an early position like this, you hate to call and then get raised off your hand, and you've committed chips without even getting to see a flop. Well, it worked out nicely, huh? So we're going to note here that this guy's raising from under the gun with Jack-9 suited, or one off the gun. That's not necessarily a bad play. We don't note, hey, this guy's a fish. He raised with Jack-9 suited in early position. The blinds are very small, and some loose aggressive players will do this. It's probably not a big winning play, but it's not a terrible play. This isn't something where we can say this guy's an idiot. We need to abuse him. He's just playing a little loose when the blinds are really small and trying to accumulate some chips. That's not a big crime. It's not how I play, but we can't say that he's completely clueless. He might be a little clueless in that he tried to bluff the calling station there a couple times. But what are you gonna do? He tried to win the pot. The calling station, however, we're definitely going to add to notes on this player, which I did at the time, that this guy doesn't know what he's doing and cannot fold a hand. I mean, he called right down with his ace-jack there. It wasn't a huge pot, but for a lot of players, that would be considered a hero call, and I think for this guy, that's just what you do. You just call when someone bets. Unless you have a really big hand and then you raise. That's kind of, he has the standard mentality. We're glad for it in this case that a bad player gets some chips. I'd like to see that. Interesting that Big Shot Owl was still involved in this pot. Let's replay this hand. Take a look at this. So whenever you see a showdown, you can kind of go back and look through, and it's easier when things are happening live for me almost than it is in the replayer, unless I go, step by step in the replayer. While it's happening, you see, okay, the guy bet the flop. So what did he? So then you're wondering, well, when he's checked to, he bets the flop. Let's see what that is going to be. And he checks behind, and then he calls when the queen falls, even though it puts 4 spades on board. The call is probably a call he has to make since it's he's getting whatever 3 to 1 or something on his money. He's getting pretty good odds on his money. He can't be sure. That's a play that a lot of players would make just on a bluff, just to if he's got nothing and no spade. Unfortunately, if from an under the gun player like this or an early position player, it might be a different situation. But with the big blind having called a bet on the flop, you expect the guy to have a hand. Sort of, he's not going to bet a pair most of the time. It's just kind of a little basic hand reading lesson here with more advanced players. This guy's not going to bet a 5 here. He's just, if he's got Jack 5 with no spade, he's not going to bet it here. He might have called the bet on the flop, but he's not going to bet here unless he's got a spade or nothing. And since he called the bet on the flop, he's got something. And that tells us he's usually got a spade. And so if you know anything about the opponent and you know that he's a thinking player, you can probably fold here even though you're getting pretty good pot odds, because he's just not. It's very rare that he's going to have nothing and be betting nothing here. And the only thing you can beat that he's betting is a stone bluff. Otherwise, he's not going to value bet, a pair or 2 pair into a board with 4 spades. He would check and call. Most players would check and call in that spot. So you could actually fold to the bet here, to the bet of 180 into the, whatever it was, 200 something pot. You could fold to that. But Owl doesn't make a terrible call. He's got top pair here, and he hasn't seen any aggression from his opponent. So we see that Owl made a bet, raised pre-flop with a hand he would reasonably raise pre-flop with, made a bet on the flop, standard continuation bet, checked behind on the turn, as pretty much played the hand the way I would have played it, except that I probably would have folded the river there. But sometimes you got to call. Sometimes you have to call in the river when you're getting reasonable odds. Otherwise, we don't learn a whole ton from either one of these players really, except that Owl will make the standard continuation bet and then shut down on the turn. Always preaching to my students, when you're out of position, end the hand now. Every betting round, your opponents make money from their position, if they have position on you. If you have position on them, then go ahead and see flops and make smaller raises, because you don't mind so much if somebody sees a flop. But when you're out of position, you really don't want to see a flop, especially with ace-king. I don't want the button to have position on me when I've got ace-king for the whole rest of this hand. It's going to be a tough spot to be in. And I know that if I make the big raise here, I'm almost always going to take out the button, who I know is a solid player and who's going to fold 95% of the range that he would raise with here when I make this big re-raise. And the small blind I don't know much about, but I don't mind if he calls because I've got position on him and I know he doesn't have a big hand. I actually have a read on his hand range if he calls a raise from the button and doesn't re-raise, and then he calls my raise. When he doesn't re-raise, when the button raises, and small blind just smooth calls the re-raise, it tells me he doesn't have a big hand. It tells me that he's got a speculative hand of some sort, and when he calls my raise, it's going to tell me he's got a really good speculative hand, probably. And we don't know a lot about this player. If we knew more about him, we could be more sure about that. But it probably says he's got a pretty good speculative hand. And in that case, I could play very well against him. I've got position, I've got the better starting hand, and I've got a good read on his hand. Easy to play post-flop against him. I know Ruthless is much less likely to call because he's squeezed between us, and he's a smart player who's going to want to stay out of trouble this early in the tournament. So I really don't expect him to call. And if this guy calls, I don't mind. But I'd rather just take the pot down now and be done with it. Take the 140 that's in there and go on to the next hand. So that is why I make the big pre-flop raise, since I'm out of position and don't really want to see a flop. I'd like to just take the pot down now. Here, when I only raise to 50, part of the reason I only raise to 50 is so that I can call a re-raise if it's a reasonable size. Calling the re-raise is questionable. Some people would fold, some people would call. Some very good players would err on either side. I decided to call, and that's mostly because of the very steep payout structure in this tournament that I'm playing, basically willing to take risks and playing it like a cash game. I also really don't want to have people think that my blinds are for sale, or that my raises are for sale to re-raises. So I do want to present an image of a player who plays hands and who's not willing to be run over. I for most of the tournament will be willing to be run over. I get out of the way when there's a big pot happening and I don't have a big hand. But if I can sort of cultivate an image as a guy who's not willing to be knocked off of a hand easily early in the tournament, that's a good thing. That doesn't make this the right play necessarily, but it's the reason why I make a play like this once in a while. If it's the guy to my immediate left, I do want that guy to stop re-raising me. So I'll do what I have to. Here I see, there was a possibility that I could re-raise this guy, or that I could check raise this guy. And if I check raise, however, it's going to be an amount that commits me if he shoves. And I really don't want to be committed here, because if he shoves, I'm behind. If he pushes all in, he's got an overpair and I'm in bad shape. And it's very likely, if he has an overpair, he is going to shove. He might even do it with 10s or 9s, because it's a very draw-heavy board. And because of the way I've played pre-flop, he may very well shove to my check raise. If he folds to my check raise, I don't make that much. But if he shoves, I lose quite a lot. I'm okay with just calling here, seeing how the next card looks. And now I get bet off my hand. And this is one of the reasons why some players would say you don't call this raise, the re-raise pre-flop. I don't, I'm going to flop a draw most of the time rather than a big made hand, and I'm not going to be happy playing in this spot. So some of the time you're going to lose chips on this hand, but the guy's seen that I'll put up a fight now, and it may help me later. And if I had made a big hand with this, it looks like he did have an overpair, and I would have been paid off handsomely. So might have been worthwhile. I know the standard c-bet is, people make the c-bet almost every time. I do it most of the time too, but in this case, when you've raised from the button and been called by both spots, you really expect that somebody may have connected somehow with this flop well enough to play. And I'm okay with waiting to see if I hit a hand here. I make a c-bet about 80% of the time that I make a pre-flop raise. This is one of those spots where I don't. I'm okay with taking basically my pair draw and not running into a check raise. When they both check to me again on the turn, if I bet the turn, it just doesn't look credible. If I'm going to check the flop, I know I'm going to check the turn unless I hit an ace or a 10. I'm not going to convince these guys that I hit a 3 when I'm the pre-flop raiser and then I check behind on the turn. And even if they do think I hit a 3, they may have that beat. I'm not going to convince these guys I have a monster after I've checked behind on the turn. So after I've checked behind on the flop. So I then have to check behind on the turn just because that I can expect to either be called by anything, or I can expect to be raised by nothing and have to fold my hand. I don't like that much either. So I check behind and then on the river actually catch my 10. And I figure it's ahead, but I can't be called by much. I considered betting 50 or 75 here. Might have been profitable to do so, but I hate to be raised off my hand, and occasionally people will slow play that long. Occasionally people will just go crazy and make a big bluff raise on the river, and it might even work. In this case, it would work. I'll throw it away. And I also don't think I'm going to get called by much that I can beat. I might get called by King 10, a weaker 10. But otherwise, even an 8 is probably not going to call me now, and an 8 would have already bet. I don't think anybody has anything that could call me that I could beat. And as it turns out, I probably wouldn't have gotten a call from either one of these guys. Maybe I would have gotten a call from the 4s if I bet 50, but I just decided the pot was big enough the way it was. The open raise with deuce 6 offsuit from the button, something to pay attention to. The fact that this guy defended with king 4 is not terribly surprising, and actually it wasn't even a defense. It was a limp from the button with deuce 6 and a check with king 4, and he never bet his hand. I might have bet the turn, but not a big deal that he didn't bet his hand. We don't learn much about this guy. He didn't do anything particularly strange, but this guy, just more and more we see that this guy's nuts. If you're going to raise to isolate or try to make him fold, it's got to be bigger than 90. This guy's probably not going to fold no matter how much you bet, but you got to make it bigger than 90 if you want to have any chance that he's going to fold, or you want to isolate him at least, because when you raise to 90 there, you can expect to be called by the big blind a fairly good percentage of the time, and this guy's always going to call, and everybody's going to have position on you. That's a very questionable raise. I can't come up with a lot of hands where that would be a raise that I would be happy with. Make the raise to 150 or just limp along and see how the flop goes. Threw away his $90. That is not necessarily a bad play. If we see this play in a cash game, usually it is, although in micro limits, sometimes it's worthwhile. If he's got ace king here, he's probably going a little far with it. My guess is he has aces or kings, and he's hoping to get a call from the idiot. It's hard to say. I mean, with ace king, this is questionable because he's got the idiot in there who may call him with anything, but he's got a good player yet to act who's only going to call him with probably aces or kings. If Ruthless knows the guy and knows that he makes this play a lot, he would probably call him with queens, but I don't think this guy makes this play a lot. I think he makes it in this particular spot because he's in the hand with someone he considers a very weak player who he's seen just kind of make crazy plays. Now, if he's making this play with anything other than aces, kings, he's making a significant mistake. And I think even with aces or kings, I would raise to 300 here and try to get the guy to call you and make some money from him. You're just not going to be called often enough with this big raise to make it profitable. Sometimes in micro limit cash games, where you're playing nickel dime, you can shove for all $10 pre-flop, and somebody will call you with ace queen because they don't know any better. But in this tournament, I don't expect that sort of thing. And while Pam Cam has shown to be a very weak player, they have not been calling all in, making kind of these wild plays. This is somebody who's just calling down a reasonable sized bets. I don't think they're going to call this bet with hardly anything. So I don't like this bet, but it doesn't mean it's a terrible play. Now, if he showed ace-10 offsuit right now, it would be a terrible play, but we just don't know. I considered raising here to knock out Ruthless. Just decided it wasn't worth the trouble. I'd rather see a disguised flop here and see how it goes. Later, when the blinds were bigger, I might raise to knock out Ruthless because it would add more money to my stack. If there was 200 chips here in front of Ruthless and I could raise to knock him out, then maybe it would be worthwhile. But with only 30 chips, it's just really not worth it. I've got position on the guy anyway, so while I know he's a good player, I'm not too worried about him while I have position on him, and he's just limping from the small blind. Doesn't have a big hand anyway, so I'm not as worried about playing a hand with him in this spot. I like that flop pretty well, and I've got to protect my hand. I know that I'm in here against a good player and against a crazy guy who could have anything, so I've got to protect my hand. What I'm hoping to do is bet and be raised by this guy, forcing Ruthless out of the pot, because I don't want to deal with him on a rag flop like this, or he may bluff me off it or cause me some sort of trouble. But I have to at least bet it, even though I expect this guy's going to call a lot more often than he's going to raise because he hasn't been aggressive at all. Works out okay. Ruthless folds, and isolation is exactly what I wanted. If this queen was not a diamond, I might check here just to keep the pot small and keep my opponent under control. Since it's a diamond and I have the ace of diamonds, I might as well build a pot, see what I can do with it, because I'm probably ahead, and if I'm not ahead, I've got a good draw to catch up. I'm not worried about this guy raising me. If he raises me, he's got a monster, but he might not even raise with the nut flush. He just might not know any better. Couldn't have the nut flush, I guess, but I check here only because this guy might have the 7. Since he's calling me down and he could have any card, it's possible that he could have the 7. Maybe he could even have the queen, although, I think he would raise some of the time with the queen on the turn. But I decided to check to him to see if he'll ever bluff. I don't think a value bet works very well for me here. I hate to bet and have to fold to a raise. This guy doesn't bluff much, and so a value bet might work here. Just a bet fold, where I figure he's got a 7 if he raises, but I just don't. This guy's too unpredictable so far. He's not. I haven't seen enough from him to know that he's really passive enough that I can bet fold here. I decided to just check to him and see if I could induce a bluff out of him. Instead, he checked behind, and it turned out he was calling the flop with nothing, and the turn with a bad draw. And if diamonds come. If a diamond falls on the end, I get all of his chips, without a doubt. There's no way a guy like that can fold the king-high flush draw. Maybe I can't bet enough to get all of his chips, but he probably raises me with the king-high flush. But, inexperienced players typically will. So I could have won a lot more on that pot if things had gone a little differently. And this guy... at this point, I'm figuring out this guy, and I may be clashing some in the blinds if he's going to keep calling to defend his blinds, because I don't stop stealing unless somebody's going to re-steal constantly, and then I just wait for a hand. So at this point, I noticed that maybe this guy and I are going to be playing some pots. Luckily, he folded on this one to the c-bet, and if he's going to just defend his blinds by calling and then fold the c-bets on the flop most of the time, then I'm going to make more money from him than if he never defended. That's a significant mistake to be calling to defend your blinds instead of re-raising and then to just fold on most flops. That's a significant mistake that most people don't realize how much money they're costing themselves. Any fixed limit hold'em cash player can tell you, if you got a guy in the big blind who will call to defend and then will fold on most flops, you can make a ton of money from that guy. That's a big leak. That's somewhat true in tournaments as well. And I have watched poker on TV with friends. I'm not big on poker on TV, but I have watched with friends periodically. And usually the question they ask is, what is with all the checking? Especially in heads-up matches, there's an awful lot of checking, and it seems like you could bet people off their hands. You will find that good players, while they tend to be pretty aggressive, can check all the way through a hand with each other, um, especially when it's two good players in the pot. Uh, in this case, we know one of the players is not good, but also that he's got nothing. I mean, he's limping every single hand, so it doesn't. He can't bet here. He's got nothing, and he doesn't bluff much. Um, and this guy figures he's ahead, and why he's not going to get called by anything that he could beat. He might as well just check it down. But in this tournament in general, you're going to see more checking through a hand and less big pots played because these people are smart enough to not play a big pot without a big hand very often. In a $10 no limit tournament, you're going to see much bigger average pots for the first couple hours than you will see in a tournament like this, which is all the more reason to not play a big pot without a big hand, because if somebody else is willing to play a big pot, they've got a big hand, and you better have a bigger one. You could fold this hand if you want to. If you're not comfortable, whatever, it would be acceptable to fold this hand in this position. Jack 10 suited is overrated by a lot of players who, have either played fixed limit hold'em or no limit cash games and really fallen in love with it because it's such a speculative hand. But it's really, it's hardly any better than 6-7 suited when you're playing no limit, especially against good opponents. A top pair is not going to win you very many chips with this hand. So, and it may have negative implied odds when you flop a pair with this. I decided to call here because I thought Univ Gem been making some moves that were a little questionable, and I know I'm not going to be playing any speculative hands once the blinds move up another level or two here. If I'm going to accumulate chips with speculative hands, now would be a bad time to do it. And my hope was that PamCam was going to get in the hand too, but chose not to. Questionable call pre-flop exactly because of this sort of situation. I flop second pair and can't even defend it. The guy either has a spade or a bigger made hand than I do the majority of the time. When he doesn't have a bigger made hand than I do, he's probably got a hand that can hit one. I just can't stand a lot of pressure here. If I raise, it's completely on a bluff. If he comes over the top with ace king with the ace of spades, I've got to fold, and I'm folding to a hand where I'm almost 2-1 favorite. Well, with the ace king, I wouldn't be 2-1, but even if he's got ace 4 with the ace of spades, I'm folding when I'm a significant favorite there. There's just no easy way to deal with this situation. If I call, I fully expect to see another bet on the turn because he's going to put me on a draw, and I can't stand a big bet on the flop and a big bet on the turn. I might as well fold now and save the chips. A lot of players will play this hand, and then the reason that they shouldn't be playing it is because they'll call a bet on the flop and fold on the turn, and it'll end up costing them another 200 on top of the 100 they initially put in when they had very little chance of winning the pot on the flop. Looking ahead and seeing that the things are going to go badly if you call a bet here saves you a lot of trouble. And while your hand might be ahead right now, that's not enough reason to call a bet. I am a little looser in these tournaments, as you're seeing, than I am, like, say, when I'm six tabling a 45-man sit and go. In those, in the early levels, I'm very tight, as you should be in sit and goes and often in multi-table tournaments. With a little smaller starting stacks where the implied odds are not as good, where the blinds are bigger compared to the stacks, you can't play as many hands. When there is a lot of aggression at the table, you can't play as many hands. And when you're playing a bunch of tournaments, you can't play as many hands because you can't focus on it enough. In this case, I was only playing this one tournament and was very focused on my opponents and felt like I could play some more hands and make them profitable early in the tournament than I would usually if I were playing multiple tournaments. You know, I would have folded probably 3 of the hands I've played so far if this were a 45-man sit and go, just because the implied odds aren't as good, and I don't play nearly as many hands in those things as I do in a tournament like this one. And this is, you know, usually when you see somebody got all in pre-flop with ace-king this early in the tournament, you wonder about how good a player they are, but he's against this guy. So, I mean, ace-king is a monster against this guy. In this case, he happened to have kings, but, I mean, he could easily have ace-10 there and think it's the nuts, the way he's been playing. So there's somebody who donated $300 to the prize pool for the rest of us. We appreciate it. There aren't nearly enough of those kind of people around these days. I like to see them. Again, seeing players who are able to check a hand through. If you've got a chance to win it but not enough to bet it, not a strong enough hand to bet it, then that's the right way to do it. And it looks like we're approaching 45 minutes here. I better chop this thing and start at video number 2.